Welcome everybody to this balmy Monday evening. My name is Mina Jane and I am one of the programming librarians at the Cary Library, and I'm really pleased to be here with Amy Callahan, who's going to be talking to us about propaganda, media literacy, and all of that, which is so on our minds. But before we get to that, I'm going to just say a couple things. I have enabled captions on this meeting, and you can disable them if you want by clicking on live transcript at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and there's a little arrow and you can hide or show your subtitles if you would like to have them or not have them. I'd like to thank the Library Foundation. The Cary Library Foundation supports all of our adult programming, and without them, we would not be able to do as much, and that is remarkable. And I would like to say that after, Amy's going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then after that, she's going to take questions both live, so you'll be able to unmute yourselves, and in the chat. So feel free to engage with us on this topic that is, again, on our minds. So Amy Callahan, oops, let me see if I can get my notes up, is the Dean of Liberal Arts at Northern Essex Community College. And before that, she was a professor in the English department and the coordinator of the Journalism Communications department. Before joining NEC faculty in 2000, she worked for more than 10 years as a journalist and editor, including writing for the Boston Globe, the Holyoke Transcript Telegram, and the Vineyard Gazette, where she received honors for the from the New England Press Association. She's also the former managing editor of the Columbia University Record, published by Columbia University's Office of Public Affairs in New York City. So as you can tell from this introduction, Amy is well qualified to have this conversation with us. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that lovely introduction, and I'm happy to see the crowd that's here tonight. I'm hoping to have a good conversation after I say a few, talk a little bit about disinformation and the problem that's in society today that we're all experiencing. So I'm going to spend the first bit here talking about disinformation, a little bit about the scope of the problem, but I was going to focus on measures that are being taken right now to address the problem. So while this is a big problem that we should be concerned about, I also wanted to at least give you some information about how it can, and in many ways I think should be addressed. So thank you again for inviting me, and thank you for making good use of the Speakers Bureau at Northern Essex Community College in Haverhill and Lawrence. That's how I got connected with you all. As Mina said, my name is Amy Callahan. I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts at Northern Essex. So I'll be focusing on the different varied approaches to combating the anti-democratic forces of disinformation on the internet, with a special focus on media literacy. So, like I said, we'll have time for discussion after I speak for a bit, and I'm really eager to hear your perspective on the problem and also your experience of it, since we've all experienced this. We've all experienced the problem of disinformation in one way or another. So a little bit about the scope of the problem to begin with, which is, as you probably well know, recent concern over the widespread public consumption of disinformation has drawn attention to questions about the impact. And media literacy, research into mass media and its effect on society has been around for about 100 years, and there are various theories about how the mass media affects society, and we'll get into those a little bit. But disinformation as it exists on the internet today is a somewhat new phenomenon that is presenting itself as quite a problem for us. Signs indicate that the consumption of disinformation, sometimes known as fake news, by the general population is relatively commonplace. Just for example, a study suggested that the average American encountered between 1 and 3 stories from known publishers of fake news during the month before the 2016 election. And of course, even when credible news organizations present information that has been fact-checked, the effect on news consumers can be mixed. So even when we are presented with information that is credible and accurate, whether or not people absorb it and believe it, we can't necessarily rely on that. And the reasons for this are rooted in cognition and how people are wired to learn. We often don't question the credibility of information unless it contradicts our existing beliefs. So you no doubt have heard of the cognitive processes contributing to this: selective exposure, confirmation bias, desirability bias. So in addition to the problem of disinformation, we're looking at, as we look at the scope of the problem, concern over the rise of authoritarian leaders worldwide in recent years has definitely drawn attention to this problem. Civic leaders, educators, free press advocates are calling for media literacy education as a possible solution to protecting democracies here and around the world. Contributing to this problem is the issue of people's inability to identify credible information online. There's a couple of troubling studies out of Stanford University, one from a few years ago and one recently is more of an update, which basically tells us that most young people have a very difficult time determining information online, whether it's credible, and even knowing what to do about it when they encounter or even having an awareness of that information should be checked. So in fact, the researchers have called the situation bleak when talking about young people and how they consume information on the internet, disinformation on the internet. So there's that. In fact, I was going to just read a quote from that study. It just came out the other day. Came out a couple weeks ago. Actually, no, a couple earlier about a week ago. The quote I have here is: a national survey of 3,446 students, 52% believed a Facebook video, which was produced in Russia, constituted strong evidence of US voter fraud. Only 3 in 3,000 tracked down the source, which was relatively easy to find. So this was a pretty discouraging bit of information from the study, that such a small percentage of high school students, this was a research on high school students, that so few of them bothered to look it up. Lastly, just sort of in this intro that I'm talking about, many of you have been following the news, and you may know that the former President Trump was permanently banned from Twitter and from Snapchat, and is currently locked out of Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube for, they say, his role related to the violent uprising on January 6th over the false claim of election fraud in the November 2020 election. So, Donald Trump has appealed that policy. So time will tell if he gets back on to Facebook. So, considering all these factors, right, that I've just gone over, we have what I consider and have concern about as it's like a perfect storm that we're experiencing right now. Our cognitive processes make us predisposed for confirmation bias, and perhaps sets us up as easy targets for conspiracy theories and other false information on the internet that can be somewhat seductive. Internet networks are fast, they're enormous, they're superficial. And I mentioned before different media theories that we can explain, that seek to explain how mass media affects society. And so these theories basically point to that we are unlikely to make good decisions in our media consumption habits. Some of these theories include the third person effect, which argues that each of us recognizes that the media can influence our thinking, but we tend to think that it's the other guy, that we are able to sort of see what's happening and sort of resist some influence, but we sort of worry about all the other people who are being duped. Given all this, I think a really good question for us to ask as a society is, what is being done to combat disinformation on the internet? And so I'm going to talk to you about some of the strategies being used now. This is all very, very current. So number one, first of all, we see the platforms, the companies, Facebook, Google, which is owned by Alphabet. I mention it because of YouTube, the social media video sharing. Twitter. These platforms are starting to take some action. Of course, it's taken them quite a long, maybe it's too little, too late, but we are starting to see the platforms do some work around moderating themselves, employing people who will kick people off or remove content, taking this step to remove the former President Donald Trump from using the platforms. And these media companies all along have been resisting, saying, oh, we're not responsible, we're not media companies, as if they're sort of this neutral space. But of course, they use these algorithms that actually do determine sort of what the users and what the consumers are seeing, what videos are suggested that you watch on YouTube. There's been some studies, some reports that show, for example, that YouTube was contributing to the consumption of radicalizing video content, because their algorithms recognized that these were videos that caught people's attention. And YouTube has an interest in wanting you to see more videos and suggesting videos to you that would catch your attention. So this is not just a neutral technological architecture, as one researcher refers to as the platforms that they consider themselves to be this neutral territory, but of course they're not. And we did see, Congress recently just called in the CEOs of Facebook, Google and Twitter, and ask them about, well, what are you doing to combat this problem? So we do have the government sort of slowly, it's taken them a while to recognize that perhaps there should be some kind of regulation. One thing that's held them back, some people would argue, although I'm sure there are many factors why the government has been slow in doing it, is there is a provision in one of the media laws. It's section 230, which actually provides immunity to these platforms for third-party content. So we actually don't have a law in place that can hold these companies accountable for what they allow on their websites. And of course, you may be thinking about, well, this is a free speech issue, and I'd love to talk about that in a minute if you want to get into that as a free speech issue. But anyway, so that's one thing that's happening to combat disinformation or to address it, that the platforms, the actual companies, social media companies are sort of in the mix now, either controlling themselves or now having the government consider regulating them. Another interesting step that's happening to address disinformation is that tech companies who profit from hate groups are getting pressured from nonprofit organizations who are, seeking to shut down the hate group activity. So nonprofit groups like Media Justice, The Color of Change, have been doing things, getting in touch with, for-profit companies to pressure them to stop doing business, to stop making money off of dealing with hate groups. And these aren't social media companies that I'm talking about. I'm talking about perhaps financial management companies and things like that that might serve as that are just helping these organizations to sort of exist. So that's two that I've just named. A third thing that we see happening to combat disinformation on social media and in society is the widespread calls for an increase in media literacy education. And this is a little bit related to the earlier study that I mentioned out of Stanford, where we see that this is a problem, right? That young people aren't as prepared as we'd like to think they are when they get onto the internet and start navigating all that's out there. And so we're seeing that the media literacy education activity, we see it coming even from the journalism sector, that some newspapers are starting to get involved in offering partnerships around educating the public. Definitely libraries. Here we are at the wonderful Cary Library this evening. Librarians are often out in the forefront on educating the public about credible sources and that sort of thing. So we have this call for an increase in media literacy education. Even the European Commission a few years ago cited media literacy education as one of the pillars of its plan for moving ahead in fighting disinformation. And we see countries such as Sweden have instituted national education policies. So school children are being taught how to identify disinformation. We are also seeing a little bit, this is also related to the commercial sort of for-profit sector, where you have companies pushing back against claims of pushing back against disinformation claims. So so many of you are probably aware that a few months ago in January, the Dominion voting systems sued a Trump official for making what they say are false claims around sort of voter fraud during the election, which we know to be false. So we'll see how that lawsuit goes, but that's a $1.3 billion lawsuit. So this is, that could have some effect as well in sort of chilling out disinformation claims. You see a bunch of other things happening too around fighting disinformation. There was a piece in the Globe not too long ago, even an opinion article, someone saying that, one way to fight disinformation is for increased government transparency, so that so that there isn't this void that needs to be filled with inaccurate disinformation. So that we'll see lots of different ideas around how to fight disinformation, and I'd like to hear what some of your thoughts are after I finish speaking in a few minutes. And one of the more exciting things I think that's happening around disinformation is the really serious, excellent academic research going into the extent of extremist groups on the internet, how they use the internet as a recruiting tool. And this is a pretty vital area right now in fighting disinformation, is the academic research into media. And so before we have our discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I do think that it is time for regulation. And I'm saying this as somebody who, I've worked as a journalist, and I consider myself a free speech advocate. And but I do think that we need some regulation around what is published on the internet, what people have access to. The situation with the hate groups, I think, is quite dangerous for our society and should not be, and there should be more regulation around that. And I do think it's time to have a little bit, government step in a little bit. Well, I was going to mention this thing about that in Australia a couple of weeks ago. The Australian government sought to require Facebook to pay news organizations for journalistic content that Facebook was publishing. And at first glance you might think, well, that's not a bad idea. Journalists should be compensated for the real work that they're doing, and Facebook is just sort of disaggregating this content. But you sort of look behind this as and apparently it was related to Rupert Murdoch's effort to sort of stick it to Facebook a little bit as a competitor. So we'll see. Facebook responded by saying, "Okay, fine. We'll just ban all the news sites from this platform," which is also not a good solution. Anyway, that was temporary. I think they're back on now, but that is a complicated case that I thought was interesting in recent weeks. So if you're up for it, I would love to hear some of your thoughts around some of your concerns about disinformation. If you have questions, what you think about government regulation. Do you think it's a bad idea? Do you think it's a good idea? I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. I'm sure you have.
So I'm going to tell people too that you can turn your videos on. For the recording, only Amy will be showing up, so you don't have to worry about being on screen. And you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. If I see you unmuted, I will call on you to ask a question. So Joel, I see you've unmuted yourself.
I have. First, let me thank you. I really appreciate your taking the time to do all this research and make this presentation. You're not going to be happy with what I have to say, though. I think the views that you're espousing here are unbelievably dangerous. I don't want to make a speech, so I want to be very brief here. I'm in an awkward situation where I could make a much better case given a lot of time. What you're not focusing on at all, it's great. You talk about fake news and the internet and young people being duped by Russian propaganda, and you don't call that censorship. I sure do. But we had on the mainstream media, where I put the greatest concern about freedom of the press, we had Rachel Maddow shooting her mouth off for 2 or 3 years about Russiagate that came out to be almost completely false by the Mueller report and by the Senate committee. Have extensive lies by the OPCW suppressing whistleblowers about what happened in Syria. We have blocking of Bernie Sanders when he ran for office, not giving him the kind of media access that other prominent candidates were given. We have blacklisting of people like Noam Chomsky, Chris Hedges, a former New York Times Pulitzer Prize winner, and many others. The lack of support for heroic whistleblowers like Assange, Snowden, and others, in spite of the fact that the Times just loved leaking, putting in the press all of the Daniel Ellsberg stuff. So my concern is that we have centralized corporate media. That's where the lies are coming from, not these little tiny things about Russia duping young people. Is going to end up leading to war. This is American propaganda, and they're not putting out truth. They're putting out, pro-American policies, and I would hope we could rely on the press to present the truth. So I'd like to hear your comments about some of that.
Well, I really appreciate your perspective on that, Joel. And in many ways, my views align with yours. I also think that censorship is dangerous, and I do oppose it. When I'm talking about recommending more regulation around some of the content on the internet, I'm talking specifically about hate group activity. That's my concern. And for many years, when I was teaching mass communication classes, I did spend a lot of time talking to my students about the problem of concentrated media ownership, which you just pointed out as well, right? That these big corporations all own sort of the mainstream media. And for a large extent, that's true. I mean, much of the sort of media that we consume, unless we're really making a big effort to consume media from independent sources, which is kind of hard. You have to make it a real effort to do that. Most of what we consume on an everyday basis can be, the ownership can be traced back to just a few really large mega corporations, as you know, and I do still think that's a concern. Lately, it has become sort of almost a secondary concern for me because of the hate group activity, and because of what we know about our young people's inability to make sense of what they're encountering on the internet. Does that?
Well, I don't want to take up too much time, but let me just say this. I'm watching people that I follow with their podcasts on the web. People I think are heroic. They're fantastic researchers. I would refer you to one website called thegrayzone.com. Democrats, who are the worst at this censorship because they hated some of the leaks that went on that Assange did during the Clinton-Trump 2016 election, are calling for the kind of censorship you seem to be calling for. If you're talking about hate groups, I couldn't be more with you. But I am watching people like Chris Hedges talking about the suppression of his voice on the internet. The guy is a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's a former bureau chief at the New York Times. This is not some crazy hate group guy. So I would encourage you to be very surgically precise. You want to talk about hate groups, I'm with you 110%. But what's happening right now is this moronic, knee-jerk McCarthyism of blacklisting credible intellectuals and blocking them from giving people like me an opportunity to converse with them and hear from them.
Well, that's an interesting point. Remember, when I say regulation, I'm talking about government regulation, right? The platforms themselves have been doing some of this moderating of who gets to be on the platform. And I'm assuming when you're talking about Hedges that maybe his account has been shut down briefly on Twitter, or right, that the companies themselves are kind of shutting him up.
It's really the Google search algorithm that is to accommodate some of the suppression that is being discussed here.
Yeah, and that's not government censorship. So let's be clear. Let's be clear about that. Yeah, it is. It's corporate. Yes.
You know, when you call for companies that are corporate explicitly, I mean, Facebook and Twitter and others are not there to provide a public outlet. They're there to make money. And is that the kind of censorship that you want, to put a chill through the voice of the people, where we have an opportunity, because we don't own large media networks, to be able to really?
The answer to that is no. That is not the kind of censorship that I want. I'm not calling for censorship. But I do appreciate your perspective. It's really hard to separate out, and maybe we shouldn't, and maybe we can't, the sort of the political dimension. It would be nice, wouldn't it, if we could talk about that everybody could agree that hate groups are bad and should be and their voice should be shut down. But
I don't want to see the corporations like Google and Facebook and Twitter have power over my freedom of speech and yours. That's not the right governance system.
Well, private company, yeah, well,
I'm going to interrupt.
He gets to decide what he wants to have on there. But yeah, why don't we leave it here? Why don't we leave it for now, Joel, and we'll get some other perspectives as well.
That'd be great. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you as well. So I think I'll look in the chat.
Yep.
And see what's there.
Susan's written a lot of good stuff.
Good. As a journalist, how would you verify the following claims in the internet or mainstream media unless certain laws I will then mention below are changed by journalists? Okay, here we go. This is a multi-part question. How do you, presidential candidate claims he's such a genius, he graduated 2 years early from it. So you asked me, how would I verify that? That one seems pretty easy to verify. If a presidential candidate is claiming that he graduated 2 years early from the college, even though the colleges have FERPA laws that prevent them from releasing a lot of information about students, you could get that confirmed.
Okay, well, wait a minute. Well, slow down. First of all, FERPA does not pertain to private schools, only public. So I mentioned this candidate says he went to a private Ivy League school, which is private. Private means private. FERPA has nothing to do with it.
Okay,
so
fair enough.
How are you going to go get this presidential candidate's Ivy League private school academic transcript?
You want to know how I would do it?
A journalist. You said you were a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, I would. I don't know. I'll have to think about that. I probably.
Okay, let me. With all due respect, Amy, the answer is there's no way for you to do it. Not you, but a journalist. Let me just.
A good journalist could do it.
No, let me tell you though, who is allowed to do it. Okay, if that presidential candidate went to work for Procter & Gamble, that employer could go ask for that transcript. or if that presidential candidate wanted to sit on a board of directors, the stockholders could go ask for that transcript. But me, a voter, and you, a journalist, have no legal right to go get it.
Okay. And you're concerned about that?
Well, we don't have the same rights as a corporation. I'm a little concerned, yeah, because sometimes a presidential candidate never really needs a job. They work for their family and friends. They never had to go get an academic transcript to get a job, but they made a career of public service claiming they have all these credentials that actually don't exist. And their friends and family know it, but the voters and you don't, because you're under the impression you can go get it and you can't.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I have to say, I think there's in many ways much more compelling and sort of earth-shattering falsified information by some candidates rather than their college record. But sure, I'll give you that one. We should have more access to that.
Okay, and the flip side of my question very quickly is that the FERPA law that you mentioned, which for others who may not know it, the Family Educational Right to Privacy Act, which does apply to public universities, also prevents you from getting that transcript. But again, if that candidate went to get a job in a corporation, the corporate employer could go get it. The board of directors and the stockholders can go get it. But you, the journalist, and me, the voter, we can't go get it unless you were to file a lawsuit, which is allowed under that law, but they never do. The journalists never do. They just publish that the candidates are geniuses. And well, by the way,
Susan, if you'll allow me to interrupt you for a moment.
I'm done.
Okay, thank you. I was just fact checking you. And FERPA, if a private school receives public funds, it applies. So, and it's really quite unusual to have even a private college or university that doesn't receive any public, research funds and things like that. So it actually covers a really large.
Okay, but FERPA does the same thing. It doesn't allow you, the journalist, to get it. It's another gate. It's
yeah, I mean, I suppose so. But like I said before, I'm not sure a candidate's college transcript is my most pressing concern when they're running for office. But I'll share. I will agree with you that it would be to the public benefit to have more of those things available.
Well, just to summarize in one sentence, if we're going to talk about misinformation and how to stop misinformation, you have to identify the gates that are keeping the misinformation out there. And those are two gates, FERPA and private schools, and journalists who do not attempt to verify information. And I'm not blaming journalists. I don't mean to sound that way, but the two examples I gave you, I'll tell you, are true life stories. And you want to know who those presidential candidates were?
Sure, go ahead.
G.H. Bush and his son, Jeb Bush. Both are college dropouts and no journalist will ever report it.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah, I know, because no journalist asked the question. The New York Times and the Washington Post go, oh, these guys are academic geniuses, even in his obituary.
I don't know if anybody called them academic geniuses, but.
Maureen Dowd did.
Well, there you go.
In the New York Times.
So I'm going to thank you, Susan.
Case closed. Case closed. Thank you. Thank you for letting me speak.
Oh, sure. Thank you. I appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
So I wanted to kind of maybe follow up on that a little bit, Amy, is that, people in politics lie, some stretch the truth, some just outright lie. How did it get to this point where people really can't tell the difference between somebody who's telling the truth or close to the truth and somebody who's just outright lying? Or is it just like is it just become so perpetuated that we just don't know how to tell the truth anymore?
Well, I like to make a distinguish, yes, politicians lie. Our elected officials lie. I don't think any of us are so naive to sit there and think like, oh, I want to truly, I expect, all the candidates in my government to be truthful all the time. I mean, we should expect that, but I don't think anyone's naive enough to think that that's how it's going to go all the time. My concern about disinformation is about the overwhelming sort of this vast, this volume of information about the reality of the world being distorted. And I view that in some ways as separate from sort of the typical back and forth that we perhaps cynically have grown accustomed to in the political arena, where that stuff's been going on for a while. The thing that's different now about disinformation is that the internet, right, and and we no longer have the gatekeepers that we used to have when it came to mass media, right? Previously, newspapers, the TV news, those are the places where we had to get our news. And now we can just kind of hop on to the internet and get your information from really anybody, anywhere in the world, who might be posting videos on YouTube or publishing a blog, or, Joel mentioned a podcast. These things are all out there for us to consume. And if we don't know what we're doing, we could be consuming an enormous volume of just outright fabrications, and that's where I think that's where we get into trouble. Does that?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you. We have a couple of questions in chat too.
Okay, let's see what we've got here. How do you teach not only children but adults as well as how to be discerning consumers of information? Well, that's a very good question. So, media literacy education, we think of it as somewhat new, but it's actually, this country has kind of a long history of trying to educate young people about the media. Even as far back as the 30s, there was curriculum in the American schools about how to spot propaganda from foreign governments or bad actors. So we do have a tradition here in this country where we have sort of been introducing this type of thing in schools. Lately, there have been a few different, well, not lately. In the middle row, in the sort of the middle time, there were two different approaches to media literacy education. One was sort of the protectionist mode, where it's like, we need to protect our young people against propaganda. We need to teach them how to spot this information that's false. And then there was this sort of a producer mode of, oh, if we just teach our young people how to create their own content, if we teach them how to become producers and not just consumers, then they'll really know about how all of this works, and they'll be better prepared to sort of go out there and consume stuff. They'll understand the systems more, and they'll be able to navigate it better. Lately, one of the newest forms of media literacy education is something called lateral research. And this tells young people to, anytime you see anything on the internet, you should be simultaneously fact-checking it. And if you can sort of determine who produced this information, and if you can find, a couple of other sources that can confirm the information, sort of mainstream type of news organizations, if you can find a few different of those to confirm the information, then you probably it's probably a fairly safe bet that it's credible. That's just one those are a few of the tactics that sort of have been used and are being used to teach people how to be discerning consumers of information. Does that answer your question, Sandra?
Yeah.
I hope that's helpful.
Actually, Mary and Jerry both have sort of follow-up questions or comments about that same question.
Okay, frustrating to get commentary and not reporting. Yes, who can you really believe? Attempt to tune in multiple sources. Well, here is an area where journalists really, I'm sorry to say, because I like to defend journalists, but this is where journalism, I believe, has to take some of the blame. When you say frustrating to get commentary and not reporting, right? And this is what we see. So much of what we expect and what we should expect to be journalism is sort of opinion, right? You're watching your news program, or you're on the internet looking for news at a news publication, and so much of what they are offering is opinion. It's commentary, and sometimes it's very good, and sometimes that's what you want, right? Sometimes you actually want to hear someone's opinion that is informed and giving you their perspective. But I think where we've lost ground is that so much of what people are consuming on, say, television, mainstream media, is packaged as, it's like, it's opinion, but it sort of maybe comes across as news at first. And one of the reasons why we see this is because opinions are cheap, right? And real journalism is expensive. It's expensive to do real reporting, first of all, to have trained journalists who know how to gather information, who know how to deal with sources, who know how to put the news together in an objective way. So that's an expensive proposition, and it's just so much easier to hire a couple of different people with opposing views and sort of stick them on, and you've got a cat fight, and isn't that entertaining? And and it kind of goes back to what media scholar Neil Postman was saying in the 1980s when he predicted this kind of mess that we're in right now. Basically, is that he said, with the introduction of TV and electronic journalism, electronic media, as he called it, we have become predisposed to only be able to receive messages and information packaged as entertainment, and that we are losing our ability to even receive complexity or something that's a little more difficult to grapple with, that we just kind of fall into, well, if it's entertaining enough, I'm going to watch it. I hope, Mary, that was a useful answer to you. I'm looking at another question now. There are organizations and websites that provide guidance on how to spot fake news. That's true. Can you recommend 2 or 3 that you think are particularly reasonable and helpful? How to spot fake news? Well, there's some news organizations that are involved in this. There's one called the News. Here, if you give me a second, I'm going to find these names for you. There's also fact-checking sites like, Snopes, I think it's called. The News Literacy Project. Here we go. The News Literacy Project is kind of a news-based organization that works with educators to provide some curriculum, and they have some tools on there. There it is. Thank you, Mina. And then there's different fact-checking sites that teachers will use. If you hear some kind of conspiracy theory, or you think you've heard something, you're like, that doesn't sound quite right, I'm just going to go to a fact-checking site. I think one is called Snopes. People heard of that one?
That one I've heard of.
Yeah, I'm sure Mina could actually tell you more than I could about these, about those types of websites where you can go check your how to spot fake news. But you know, honestly, Jerry, this is my opinion about this is actually, I'm sort of like, well, don't go in that neighborhood. You know what I mean? Like, it's more like, don't, a couple of things. First of all, I wouldn't just be consuming whatever on the internet and thinking like, oh, I'm going to be able to spot, you know, propaganda or fake news or disinformation, because it's really hard these days. Especially with these things, you know, like deep fakes, where we can now have videos of people saying things and doing things that they haven't actually done. These are just completely fabricated. That's just one example. But so my point is, like, when you set out to get information, go to places that you can feel confident are relatively credible. And even then, if you feel like it's a slanted news organization, also go to another news organization that you know might be slanted in the other way and check it there. So, you know, but I'm still a big fan of newspapers, you know, what we think of as the old print newspapers. I think for the most part, they have excellent journalists. You may disagree with their editorial pages, you know, for example, the New York Times, I think their reporting is solid. You may disagree with what they have on their opinion pages, and that's perfectly reasonable. Wall Street Journal, credible news organization. You may disagree with what's on their opinion pages, but you know, that's just an example of, or the Boston Globe. I mean, these places employ trained journalists who, for the most part, are going to give you accurate information. You know, is it going to be slanted some of the time? Yes, it is. I'm not going to tell you that it isn't. But you know, but in terms of being able to get information, there are credible news organizations where you can get information. But if you're only getting your news off of Facebook, I think you're going to have a problem, because who are you following, and who are they resharing? And you know, in my opinion, Facebook is a great place to find out, you know, sort of what your siblings or, you know, nephews and nieces or, you know, are doing. But it's really a horrible place, I think, to get news. I hope that helps.
Can I just make one comment about the newspapers? Is that the thing that you just said about, you know, they have good reporting and then they have opinion sections. Those are very obvious, you know, in those papers, is that this is what a journalist, you know, did some research on and wrote a story on, versus this is opinion from our contributors or from, you know, the public. So to me, that's a clear sign of like what is maybe slightly slanted, but also real news versus opinion.
Are you asking me how can you tell the difference?
No. I just said that in the newspaper, they try to make it clear, like, these are news stories and these
they
are
try, but they don't do a good enough job, in my opinion.
Okay.
You know, and I, like I said, I defend journalists. We need them. We should support them. We should pay for our newspapers. But I think newspapers, especially since many of us are reading them on the internet now, right? With you're reading the digital version. I think they need to do a little bit better job of saying this is an opinion column, this is commentary, and this is straight up reporting. You know, and it's, you know, I like to point something out too, that in the history of this country with journalism, right, one of the foundations, one of the pillars of our democracy is a free press, right? It's called the Fourth Estate because it's, you know, sort of a quasi fourth branch of government. Of course, it's not a fourth branch of government, but it is, you know, it's seen in that realm as just as important as the other the three branches of government. But journalism in this country, of course, didn't start out with any kind of standard of objectivity, right? The first newspaper, you know, the partisan press was this era that we had where newspapers, the point of many newspapers was to promote an opinion about something. So while I want newspapers to do a better job of labeling what is sort of objective, straight up news and what is opinion, I certainly am not opposed to newspapers and news organizations having opinions or writing commentary. I think it's part of our newspaper tradition in this country, and I think it actually has a lot of value to know where your what is the political perspective of the people who are gathering your news. I think that is helpful to know. So I'm looking over here in the chat too. Somebody's saying, you know, just expressing frustration, like, well, where do you get your news? Where can you trust anything? Well, in some ways, maybe we should abandon the notion that, you know, that news can be truly objective, right? News organizations do often have a political slant. And I think if you're aware of it, it'll help you synthesize your news better. You know, what do I read? I read, you know, you probably could predict what I read. I read the Boston Globe. I read the New York Times. I read the Wall Street Journal. I read the New Yorker magazine. I read the Economist magazine. I'm on Twitter, so I follow a lot of different people on Twitter and different organizations. So, you know, I'm receiving a lot of information and trying to make sense of it. I follow a lot of I read academic scholarly articles, which you know, can also be very useful because they have standards not of objectivity but of you know, peer review and research. Was that helpful, Kate?
We only have a couple more minutes, so I'm wondering if ethics can be our last question. Susan, I know you have one as well. Actually, there's a couple more. I don't know how long you wanted to go on for.
Oh, I love this question. Do you think journalists should be required to be licensed? No, I do not think journalists should be required to be licensed, because then who gets to choose, who gets to decide, right? I mean, I don't think, as part of free speech in this country, you have the right, every single one of us has the right to this evening, print up a newspaper and go hand it out in the town square. We have this right of free speech in this country, and I think it needs to be protected. So no, I do not think journalists should be licensed by the government. But you know, but I think consumers should be very careful about who they sort of buy their news from and consume it from.
Yep. So I was saying maybe Effie's question can be our last one.
Okay, Effie's questions. What are colleges like yours doing to help students learn how to question what they are reading and hearing? Do you offer courses, elective or required? Well, I would like to see media literacy education much more widespread in the American education system. I think one of the best ways to train people to around media literacy is to give them some journalism training. If you actually become trained in some regard to understand what journalists do, then it can help you understand how to consume media and news, I think, in a much more informed way. You know, what else are we doing? We have a lot of specifically what colleges are doing, such as at my school, we have things like information literacy graduation requirements, where students are required to take a course where they learn information literacy skills in order to graduate. They have to do that, and that is fairly common in higher ed, to have these kind of core academic skill requirements. So we're seeing more and more of it in the educational environment. So that's good news, Effie, at least. But boy, we really need more of it.
So I wanted to come back and just say thank you, Amy. This has been a rousing conversation of very timely proportion of, it's like I said, on our minds, but also we have such differing opinions and thoughts on these topics. So I really appreciate your thoughtfulness on it and helping us think about how we consume our social media and news. And
thank you so much.
Oh, and I think everybody who's been here with all of your wonderful questions and your passion for this topic, it's really important that we bring that to the table, because we need people to speak up and share their thoughts and do it in a way that we can have conversations. So thank you so much for being here tonight. And Amy, again, for helping us with this conversation.
Thank you. And I am so grateful for everyone who showed up and for your wonderful questions. I truly, truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Good night.